Hello everyone, and thank you for your extensive and detailed comments about how the audio in the previous video sucked. I'm referring to the one about moving pieces, and I do agree, and I have tried to improve on this. Hopefully it will be better this time. It's still the same sound. I did try to mess around with the sounds, but I did lower the volume by 50%, so it should be more manageable. Now, I know we've said that you said that I should check up on a game by Mikhail Tal, as today is November 9th, it's Tal's birthday, but in the wake of the start of the 2018 World Chess Championship, today is game 1 between Fabiano Caruana and Magnus Carlsen. I decided to postpone the Tal video only for a few days, as it is a custom on this channel to do a Tal video when this channel reaches a milestone. So hopefully in a few days this channel will reach 300,000 subscribers, and we will then have a very nice Tal video and even maybe a party, but you know, we'll see how it goes. So this is a game, but in honor of Tal's birthday, I did choose a game from Tal's Memorial. It was played in 2012, also in Tal's Memorial. And also it's a game from Carlsen and Caruana, and I think it will not give us any idea of what we can expect today, but I am interested in one move that kind of shows how Carlsen played then, and will he play like that now. So let's check it out. Carlsen has the white pieces, and he opens with knight to f3, so we have the red opening. Knight to f6, we have g3 and d5. Yeah, I just have to fix the sound, although here we're just gonna fix it by muting it, not by lowering it. Okay, there we have it, and we have d5. The King's Indian attack is on the board, the Yugoslav variation. Bishop to g2, Carlsen fianchettos the bishop, c6, and now Carlsen castles. We have bishop to g4, and now comes c4, immediately challenging the black center. We have e6, and now Carlsen does not transpose into the Slav by playing d4, but rather he plays this very, very odd c captures on d5, which is very unusual. Most of the times you do not want to break the tension in the center. Usually it's better for the person not capturing in the center, but here Carlsen does it with a very specific idea. For example, here if Caruana plays something like c captures on d5, then Carlsen will have this very nice e5 square for his knight. It will come with an attack on Caruana's bishop on g4. Also there will be threats like queen to a4 check, also threatening the bishop here. So here you would have to go bishop to h5, and then white would have a lot of options here. So by playing this c captures on d5, Carlsen actually forces this trade. Bishop captures on f3, we have bishop captures on f3, and only now c captures on d5. Here Carlsen won the bishop pair, and if he can use them on very nice diagonals, it will be very good for white. So okay, knight to c3, knight to c6, both players develop, d4, bishop to e7, we have e3 by Carlsen, we have castles by Caruana, and here Carlsen has to figure out still how to develop the dark square bishop, how to develop the queen, how to connect rooks, and so on. It's very unlikely that you will be able to push something like e4 and then develop the bishop on this diagonal, as if you ever push e4, your d4 pawn becomes weak. So for now, it's very unlikely that this will happen. So b3, he wants to develop it via bishop to b2. And okay, we have queen to a5 by Caruana, bishop to b2, and the bishop to a3. What Carlsen gained by breaking the tension in the center early on in the opening is the bishop pair. So Caruana makes the, to me, an obvious decision of getting rid of Carlsen's bishop pair. Queen to c1, we have bishop captures, queen captures, and now comes rook f to c8. And if you look at this position, it's only move 14, but you can already sense that white didn't really get anything from the opening. The material on the board is equal. It's two knights against the knight and the bishop, 2 points on the queen side each. The structure is pretty much similar on the king side as well, and black is even better in development as his rook already occupies an open c file. So not really something to be gained, but okay. We have rook to c1, knight to e7. Now Caruana's rook is also ready to exchange down the c file. We have knight to a4, and here comes knight to d7. And here, if white were to play, well, any move other than the move that was played in the game, for example, if he wants to remaneuver the bishop to a better diagonal, then we could see a line like captures, captures, and after rook comes to c8, white will improve the position of his king, and then black can also exchange further, and then after something like queen to d8, also maybe offer a trade of queens, but it really unwinds to a very drawish position, which would most likely be a draw. So here Carlsen doesn't find a way to push this for a win any further, so he tries knight to c5. A very interesting move. It comes with a pawn sacrifice, but this is something that happens very often in chess. As this is a Tal memorial, you have to create chances, one must also give chances. So let's see what happens. Knight captures on c5, pawn captures on c5, and rook captures on c5. So Caruana grabs a pawn, and it's very interesting what is the compensation behind the pawn for white. Carlsen had this in mind. We have b4, attacking the queen and the rook, but here comes rook to b5. So you don't really gain anything by capturing the queen now, as you would also lose your queen on b2. If captures, then rook would capture queen here. So first, we have a3. Carlsen defends his b4 pawn. Queen moves back to d8, and now comes e4. And, well, to this point, it was fairly obvious what would happen. Most likely this was all taken into consideration. Now if d captures on e4, then bishop captures on e4. Okay, for the price of this one pawn, perhaps the activity of the light square bishop would compensate for the price of one pawn. But Caruana ignores this. He immediately goes after this strong formation a3, b4 here, and challenges it with a5, which makes sense as the pawn on b4 is still pinned and the queen is still awkwardly placed on b2. E captures on d5, knight captures on d5, and here we have rook to c5, offering a trade of rooks. Here, if you capture, rook captures, b captures, then black would still be up a pawn, but now you have a weak b7 pawn, which you cannot push forward due to the c5 pawn, and also there's, well, this rook would be stuck defending the a5 pawn. So while you would have an extra pawn, it will be very hard to keep both of them, and the light square bishop now becomes extremely strong. So instead, after rook to c5, Caruana goes for queen to b6, simply piling up on the b4 pawn. Rook captures on b5, queen captures on b5, and now comes bishop captures on d5. Carlsen eliminates this knight and doesn't allow his bishop to ever become powerful, but there was really no other way to do it. Rook to d1 does seem to be an improvement, as it, well, it seems to be saving a tempo, because now if black does decide to capture on b4, you will only then capture on d5, and then after pawn captures, you will then recapture here, and you will already have a developed rook on d1. But okay, Carlsen plays bishop captures on d5 immediately, pawn captures, and now comes rook to c1, taking that open c file. Rook to e8, Caruana develops his rook to another open c file, open e file. And now comes queen to d4, a very nice centralizing move for Carlsen. And now, after a captures on b4, a captures on b4 that was played in the game, we have h6 by Caruana, making some breathing room for his king, a nice escape route, so there won't be any back rank weaknesses if he decides to activate his rook. And here we have a position where Carlsen is still down a pawn. It will be very unpleasant to play this. Of course, white cannot play this for a win. The position is pretty much the same, 3 pawns on the king side each, 1 pawn on the queen side each, but the difference is Caruana has a very nice passed d pawn, which he will of course try to push. And here Carlsen plays a very interesting move. He plays king g2, which is a waiting move, but also a very tricky move. Here it seems like rook to e4 should win you the game for black, as the queen now has to move, then rook captures pawn, and you're up 2 pawns, you have 2 passed pawns, of course you will be winning this, but this is actually a draw by force after rook to c8 check. King h7, and now comes rook to c5. And here we have a very interesting position where if queen captures here, then queen captures here. And then with ideas of queen to f5, rook to c8, and the queen also putting pressure on the b7 pawn, white would have more than enough resources to ever to draw this game. Also, black cannot start pushing the pawn, as the 5th rank is covered very nicely by white. But also interesting, even if you don't go for this queen captures pawn, if you go for something like rook captures queen, then rook captures on b5, you're going to eliminate the b7 pawn, so whatever black plays, you will simply capture. Now it's a completely drawn game, both players have a nice passed pawn, and it's a draw. So, after this king to g2, not rook to e4 immediately, but first Caruana improves with b6, taking away the c5 square for Carlsen's rook here. A very nice move. We have rook to d1, and now comes rook to e4, finally. Defending the pawn with rook to d8 would make little sense, because now both the rook and the queen are stuck. Protecting this passed pawn, you will not be able to push it, and black really can't make any progress here. So perhaps this would still be playable, but you would have to remaneuver everything. So after rook to d1, rook to e4, the move we've already mentioned. Queen captures on d5, we have queen captures on d5, rook captures on d5, and now rook captures on b4. Now we have this endgame where both players have 3 pawns on the king side, and it's rook against rook with 1 extra pass pawn for Caruana. So let's see how he does this. Here, h4 by Carlsen, a very interesting move. If Carlsen starts immediately with rook to d8 check, king h7, and rook to b8 to put a rook behind a pass pawn, then g5 will be a very strong move for Caruana, taking away the h4 and f4 square. The f5 pawn can come with a very nice expansion, and then the rook will help out escorting this passed pawn. Before doing all that, first Carlsen goes h4, takes away the g5 square for Caruana's g5 move, and now we have king to f8. Caruana starts bringing his king into the game, as this is what you want to do in an endgame. We have rook to d7, rook to e4. Now comes rook to b7. Of course, you have to put a rook behind a passed pawn, whether it's your own pawn or your opponent's pawn. We have rook to e6, defending the pawn, and now comes g4. And now it's very interesting, how do you push this? You can't start pushing your b pawn, and, well, you can't bring your king into the game. So it's very interesting how Caruana does it. g5. Of course, the king will come into the game via the g file. And now, if you play h captures on g5, h captures on g5, and f4, then you get g captures on f4, king to f3, and now, if the rook decides to defend this pawn, then g5 is a very nice move. And this would have been one way to play this line, and white would most likely be able to hold this. But here, Carlsen played the immediate f4. But now it's a bit different, because now Caruana plays g captures on f4, we have king to f3, and now rook to f6 defending. g5, now of course Caruana does not capture, because we get the exact same position we've just analyzed. But after g5, he simply moves the rook, rook to c6. King captures on f4 is played. Now comes a move that is basically the only move that would allow Caruana to push for the win here. But feel free to pause the video here, as this is one of the positions that might occur in your own games, so, you know, it wouldn't hurt to know how to handle it. For those of you who were able to do it, who have paused the video and solved it correctly, congratulations, you have found the only move in the endgame that allows black to push for the win. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, the move is h5. Not exchanging and lowering the chances for a win, but here you take away the g4 square from white's king, and the rook is cutting off the white king completely from the 6th rank, and the pawns really can't go anywhere, so white is really out of options here. Carlsen did go king to f5, but now comes king to g7, bringing the king into the game. Rook to b8, white has to play something. We have rook to c5 with check. King to f4, and now comes rook to b5, putting the rook in front of the passed pawn for now. King to e4, now comes rook to b1. Black is ready to start pushing his passed pawn. King to f8, king to f5, and now king to f5 comes with a trick. If you play b5 now, it wouldn't be the best idea, because now Carlsen could have played this rook to b7 move, and if you start pushing your passed pawn, then g6 would be, of course, very strong. If rook f1 check, because you cannot capture it, the rook is pinned from the rook on b7. So after something like rook to f1 check, king moves, rook g1 check, king captures, you would capture on g6, and rook captures on f7. This very nice tricky move would be available for Carlsen to draw the game, because after king captures on f7, it's a very nice stalemate. The white king has nowhere to go. But okay, after king to f5, rook to b2, first a nice waiting move by Caruana, and now Carlsen has to waste a move. King to f4, and only now rook to b4 check. We have king to e5. If king to g3, for example, then the king is cut off from this rank, and you can start pushing your pawn. So after rook to b4 check, we have king to e5, and now king to g6. Finally, Caruana brings his king closer, and now we have rook to g8 check. King h7, now comes rook to f8, attacking the pawn, and now finally rook captures on h4. Rook captures on f7, king to g6, and now rook to f6 check. If you try to go the other way, for example, rook to b7, then you get king captures on g5, rook captures, but now after rook to c4, the king is completely cut off from the h-pawn. Black will simply push it and win the game. So, after king to g6, we have rook to f6 check, king captures on g5 by Caruana, and now comes rook captures on b6. Now, it's past h-pawn, the king is somewhat cut off, and it will be very instructive how Caruana plays this. Rook to a4, making room for the pawn so it can go forward. We have rook to b8, and now king to g4. Rook to g8 check, of course, king to f3, rook to f8 check, king to g3, and now comes rook to g8 check. King to h2, and now king to f5, approaching the passed pawn. h4, we have rook to b8, and now comes h3. And here we have king to g5. It's interesting, how do you proceed if rook to b2 check? If rook to b2 check, then you have to move around a bit, but after king g3, rook checks, king moves, rook blocks pawn. Now you will play rook to a1. And now you will prepare to move your pawn, either by playing either by going rook g1 and blocking it with rook g2, or if white continues, for example, with check, then you will simply bring your king closer. For example, rook b3, king g2, rook b2 with check, king g1, rook b7, trying to go behind the passed pawn, but now simply h2, and now after rook g7 check, king f2, you can promote your pawn into a queen. Simply grab it, and then black will, of course, be able to checkmate the white king. But after h3, we have king to g5, now comes rook to e4, king to f5, and now rook to e2, not allowing any checks, rook to g8, not allowing the king to move over to the g file, rook to g2 blocking, we have rook to d8, and now we have an excellent opportunity here for you to actually not win this game. Here, if you play something like king to g1, it would actually be a drawn endgame. You would not be able to win this anymore for black for the reasons that follow. White would play king to f4. And now, if you try to push or pass pawn, for example, h2, you would get rook to d1 check. King to f2, and now there is no more way for you to actually promote the pawn. The rook is controlling the h1 square, and if you try something like rook to h1, then how can black proceed? You cannot approach the pawn with the king. If you go rook to g1 or move the rook anywhere, white will simply capture the pawn. And if you try something like king to e2, then of course you get rook to a1. And now rook to g1 is pointless because you get rook to a2 check, king moves, and rook captures on h2. So it would be very unfortunate to actually blunder the game like this with king to g1. But Caruana played rook to f2 check, and it was in this position that Magnus Carlsen resigned the game on move 62, because it doesn't matter how he proceeds. If king g4, for example, king g2, there are no more checks, the king is blocking all the checks from the g file, you will simply push the pawn and win. And if you play something other than that, maybe king e4, again, king g1, and it is all over. Whichever check white decides to give, it will be all over, as the rook can simply block, and then you will promote this pawn into a win. This is also a very nice position. I might even use this for a thumbnail. But yeah, that's the game. I do hope you enjoyed it. And something I wanted to talk about, it was this position here. After we've mentioned it. Sorry about that. After this knight to d7, we mentioned that instead of this knight to c5, Carlsen probably could have gone for bishop to e2 or something and go into a drawn endgame. So he had the white pieces, he wanted more than a draw, and he really wanted to push for a win. Which is very interesting, because in an interview Carlsen gave a few days before today, he said that he finds it really difficult to go for a win in positions that don't really have a lot of chances. He can't force himself to be creative and take these really slim chances and create something out of nothing. But it's very interesting. Here he tried with this knight to c5 move. Will he try in the 2018 World Chess Championship match? We will see. As I've already mentioned, today's game 1, and I'm very eager to see how it will go. After I upload this video, I am leaving Heathrow, going for Holborn, and I will probably have a cup of coffee there, and I do have a ticket for today. My friend Ivan Ljubicic invited me. Well, he actually got the ticket, so he offered me if I wanted to visit, and basically it's one of the reasons why I decided to come to London. But also I've never been to London, so it will be a very nice experience. But mostly I came for chess, of course, as you all might have imagined. But yeah, really looking forward to this. And one more word about this Tal's Memorial. Even though they really battled it out, neither Carlsen nor Caruana won this tournament. Carlsen was second in this tournament, but the person who actually won it was the person whose quote I've chosen for this game. The good thing in chess is that very often the best moves are the most beautiful ones, the beauty of logic. And that person, of course, is this person. You all know him. I don't think he needs any further introduction. It is Boris Gelfand when he was younger, but still a very nice photo. So yeah, I would like to thank Dame Pletvarec, William Gould, Jonathan Carmel, Bolshakov Kirill, and Udo Brand for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon with Game 1 of the 2018 World Chess Championship match. And be sure to mention if the sound was better in this video. Thank you all, and I will see you soon.